Hello and welcome to the TechGig podcast, folks. I'm Sukriti, your host. Thank you for tuning in. Staying competitive and relevant are two of the biggest factors that companies are striving for in today's time. Amid all these technological transformations, unlike all other sectors and industries, financial services technology is also currently in the midst of a profound transformation. And the CIOs and CTOs, the teams, in fact, are preparing to embrace the next major phase of the transformation that we are looking at. Now, the challenge they face is significant, and in a competitive environment of rising costs, pressures, where rapid action and response is imperative. Financial institutions must modernize their technology function to support the expanded digitization of both the front and the back ends of the businesses. Now, in today's conversation that I'll be wrapping up in 20 minutes of our podcast, our guest will brief us and on how one can stay competitive in the FSI with real-time technologies and architecture. And folks, I'm delighted to have Aveekshith Bushan, who is the Vice President Asia Pacific in Japan from Aerospike. Welcome to the show, Veek. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Hey, thank you, Sukriti. It's great to be on this show. I mean, I've been following this show for a while, and I think the content that you guys have been creating has been fantastic. So excited to be part of this podcast. And obviously, like you said, right, I've been working in this space for quite some time now. I've been working with Aerospike for about 7 years. Prior to which, I was with a company called MongoDB. Before which, I was with enterprise companies. So I've been with the data space, especially in the real-time space, for quite some time now. So I'm absolutely excited to be talking to the larger audience about how this is relevant to the FSI sector specifically.
Thanks, Avik. So let's get started with the questions, of course, as a part of our conversation. With the increasing traffic and data requirements in the FSI sector, what are the key challenges that most financial companies are facing in today's time?
Sure, great question, Sukriti. So, like we all know, right, a lot of these financial companies in India today, right? I mean, if you go back in time, 10 years back, it was really these large behemoths of companies which are doing really well, and there was not so much of a competition from digital upstarts. Ever since UPI took shape and UPI has become ubiquitous in the market, you're seeing a lot of these digital natives come over and really challenge the biggies, if you will, right? And they're challenging these biggies with things like great technology, easy to use, rapid, I mean, really, really fast, and so on and so forth, right? So now the biggies, regardless of whether it's in the banking sector or in the financial sector, they're beginning to take note of this kind of growth that's happening in the sector. Now, what does this mean? It means that all of a sudden you have requirements coming in from customers who are all of a sudden you have people who are getting online. I mean, if you go back a few years, you probably had very few people who were really online. But ever since demonetization happened and with the COVID story taking shape, there are more and more people online today. So what is happening with more and more people online is they're beginning to transact online. They're beginning to make financial transactions online. So on the other side, with the financial sector, what's happening is with this kind of a growth, they're having to all of a sudden handle massive volumes of people coming online and making these transactions. So the one side of the story is scale. The second side of the story is as more and more people are online, they're expecting these services to be lightning quick. So if I make a UPI transaction to you, Sukriti, it better be in a few milliseconds. If I go back 10 years in time, in a few minutes or a few seconds would be okay. Today, we're talking about sub-millisecond latency. So time is of essence. Now, we talked about data, we talked about time. The third factor is also about, hey, these platforms need to be running 24/7. It can't be the case that I make a payment and the platform went down. That will be terrible customer experience, and whichever the platform is, there will be, there'll be increasing competition to get the customer onto some other platform. So it better be available all the time as well. And lastly, while this happens and more people are online, it is extremely important that these platforms are can identify fraud as it happens. They can identify risk as it happens as well, because you can't have a case where people, as more and more people get online, their confidence in these systems goes down. So I think these financial companies, on the, at least from our perspective, what we're seeing is they're hit with growth, they're hit with a case where more and more customers are online, so they're having to build services which are secure and can identify fraud as it happens.
So, Avik, this entire data requirement factor and the challenges, of course, that you've spoken about are something that is important and critical, right? And everybody looks at these things, and there are strategies being built. Now, can you highlight the significance of massive scale, low latency, and high-speed processing requirements in FSI?
For sure, for sure. So let's look at an example, right? So With UPI, what has happened is, people are now, if you go back 2 years, then I was typically transacting to people through my checkbooks, or going to net banking and so on. Even to add a new beneficiary would take me several minutes to do that, and then to make a transaction. Now what's happening is within a few seconds, the entire flow is done. So essentially what is happening is, when you talk about scale, as more and more people are online, these platforms are being hit by all these people getting online. And let's look at an example. Dream 11 as a platform, right? During the IPL, all of a sudden you have millions of users getting online and transacting 10 rupees, 20 rupees as they select these teams and play on these platforms. On the back end, the banking applications that are there, they're hit with these requests for 10 rupee UPI transactions and so on and so forth. So you better be able to handle scale that a Dream 11 and these kinds of platforms are imposing on these financial companies. On the other hand, like I talked about in terms of latency or in terms of response times, customers are by de facto expecting that as they transact to these platforms, that it happens very, very quickly, and they don't have any delay in the system. If there is delay, the whole customer experience goes for a toss. In fact, we work with not just financial organizations, but even with some of the large telcos in India. And some of these telcos, if you notice, the likes of Airtel, they've transformed their business over the last few years. And one of the things that has happened is they've introduced, similar to what they had in the past for My Airtel, they have something called a Thanks app today. Now, the Thanks app gives you one application where you can look at all the services that you consume from Airtel, and also you can raise requests. You're essentially served the data which is relevant to you, so it's heavily customized to the user. But most importantly, it is very, very quick. The information that you see and the requests that you send across to Airtel is immediately handled. So latency for any kind of a industry vertical becomes very critical, and regardless of which industry vertical it is, on the downstream, it is invariably the case that the financial industry is going to be hit, because any financial transaction at the end of the day will have some kind of implication to the financial industry. And lastly, as more and more people are getting online, you might have cases where during a particular season, for example, during Diwali or Christmas and so on, more and more people are getting online. So it could be through e-commerce verticals, or it could be through online platforms. And now obviously with newer platforms getting introduced like ONDC and so on, where it's going to be more and more democratized, if you will, the online platforms, you'll have more and more people getting online and transacting together. So concurrency of these requests, right, will become another very significant factor of how these banks can handle it. And that's another key aspect of what we'll see the next few years, where banks will be having to handle this kind of a scale very, very rapidly as well. So scale, latency, and like you said, high-speed processing becomes very critical for any of these financial companies to be successful in today's market.
Okay. And, of course, with these transformation and modernization of the data architecture, coming to the, relevance that we are actually trying to talk about here, how do you foresee the future of FSI in India vis-a-vis globally?
I'm very, very bullish as somebody who is not only working in the sector, but also working with companies which are working in the sector, about the India story, right? Honestly, and I handle not just India, but the larger Asia Pacific and Japan market. I can tell you very clearly, Sukriti, that globally today, India is probably at the forefront of digital adoption. And obviously, it started off with Aadhaar initially, when people, had some kind of a digital ID, and then with UPI, and now with the whole bunch of platforms, right? I talked about ONDC. Now we're having this CBDC, which is a digital currency that is getting introduced. You're going to see something which the world hasn't seen. The kind of people, regardless of whether they're in urban areas, rural areas, and so on, everybody's getting online. Everybody's transacting online. The scary part is, if you hand over cash to anybody in India, they look at you as if you're from space. You're expected to transact through one of the phone pays or Paytms of the world, or through UPI, and that's become the de facto today in India. You compare it with other markets, even Western markets or growth, markets which are grown, you will not find this kind of digital adoption. So, and all this at the back end, if you have to support this kind of infrastructure, credit has to go to these financial institutions that have completely transformed their business. And we work with, I already mentioned a few companies, but even the likes of PhonePe and so on, which have completely transformed their business over the last few years. In fact, the experience that you get out of a PhonePe is something unbelievable. You get onto the platform, you make a payment, and you're done. And there are a whole bunch of other services that are offered as well. All this happens with an Aerospike or a similar kind of technology running at the back end. It cannot happen without that. And likewise with banks, we work with the likes of HDFC and IDFC and so on. Every one of them is transforming the business to handle the scale that is there today and what they're going to see in the days to come. Now, scale is not only because of the number of users who are online, it is also because of the number of services that are being offered by these banks. And it's scary the kind of services that are being offered today. I mean, really, honestly, I think globally, there is no other country on the planet where this kind of adoption is happening. And we are really a market leader when it comes to digital today. And that is something which I think credit has to go to the sector for having transformed their business very, very quickly and modernize the infrastructure from where they were a few years back to be able to handle this kind of requirements that's coming in from the market.
Absolutely, Vika, and I'm sure the kind of experience that leaders today have, and what they're trying to look at is a very important decision making that everybody is trying to foresee. Now, when it comes to the real time technology, which are the key factors that you would want to actually mention here, where real time technologies and architecture are playing a very crucial role.
Yeah, I mean, I think, see, one of the things that is very, very important today is, I think gone are the days when you're saying, hey, rip and replace your existing technologies, right? I mean, if you go back 20 years, a lot of the organizations which were working with, not just financial organizations, but in general, they would go to these companies and say, hey, what you have is legacy, let's rip and replace. I think today people understand that rip and replace is no more in vogue because you're trying to reduce cost and you want to do things as soon as is possible to introduce solutions. So it's very important that you augment your existing infrastructure, and that's one of the key things that we are seeing, right? Is how do you build something very quickly, which is agility, offer these solutions very quickly while keeping your existing platforms that are running. Now, over a period of time, you might want to rip and replace this or phase out these technologies because you're obviously trying to reduce your cost further. You want to make these platforms more and more distributed. You want to run these platforms across multiple data centers because you may want to have failover. You may want to have resiliency in the platforms and so on. So requirements are continuing to evolve and technologies are continuing to evolve. So I think you're going to see a case where companies are going to augment technologies to start with, but over a period of time, they're going to phase out these technologies. Now, on the other hand, I already talked about the technological challenges that are being faced today in the market, right? And this is going to accelerate in terms of latency requirements, in terms of scale. Scale in India, I mean, with 1.3 billion people and more people getting online, it's only going to accelerate over the next few years. I mean, our mobile phone today is a bigger identity of ourselves than our name as well. You can forget who you are for a few minutes, but you cannot forget your mobile phone. So that's the reality today, right? And it's going to continue to increase over the next few years. So I think real-time technologies and architectures that can facilitate that would play a very, very critical part in making sure that these companies are able to adopt their infrastructure to handle this kind of a requirement that's coming up. And that's going to be very, very critical. And real time is the way to go. You can't have a case where, I mean, we had days when people would say, okay, it's okay to be T+1 or T+2 and so on and so forth, right? That doesn't work today. You've got to be real time. And very quick example before I sign off on this question, right, is when you had, let's say you have an election or something that happened very, very quickly. Let's say a death of a superstar or something that happened very an unfortunate event. All of a sudden, you have people who are getting online and browsing for content related to that particular person or that particular event and so on and so forth. So unless your platforms are able to handle that kind of a scale that happens very, very quickly, so agility is very critical, you won't be able to service the requests of the customer. Now, this is across industry segment. I'm not saying this is relevant to one particular industry segment, right? If it is relevant at one particular industry, it's going to, and the downstream, it's going to hit somebody else. So it's very, very critical that the technology decisions that you make are increasingly becoming real time. And architecture-wise, you're looking at how do I, phase out these technologies while continuing to transform your business. So I think it's extremely critical that this is taken into consideration while companies continue to transform their business, Sukriti.
And of course, the entire transformation that we are trying to look at, we are actually seeing this transformation in different ways, and different strategies are putting are putting actually together based on the current adoption rate that you have actually mentioned of the real-time technologies in India. How do you see the future of the same in the next 5 years? And especially as more industries are adopting emerging technologies and going towards the digital transformation route, Avik.
Sure. So, like I said, right, we're going to see more and more integration across technology platforms. I mean, it's no more a case where I build something which is great but doesn't coexist with existing platforms. So you're going to see requests from financial companies and otherwise to have an ecosystem that works together. I mean, look at the whole UPI, ONDC platforms, and so on and so forth, right? It is about building an ecosystem, and this is why India is very unique, right? We are building these ecosystems, and the regulator and the government is playing a very central part to make sure that everybody comes together. You can't have a case where I build something, I mean, an Apple adapter that works doesn't work with some other platform. Interoperability is very, very critical. So you're going to see more and more requirements for people to say, hey, I'm going to get into this space, make sure that it's interoperable. Make sure that you build it on open standards so that if I have to move, it works very seamlessly. Or to make sure that cloud platforms, I mean, you don't want to be locked into a cloud platform that you cannot move out of. So companies are going to become extremely smart in the kind of decisions they're going to make when it comes to technology choices. Now, as an example, right, what we've been seeing ever since 2018-19, as you might know, Sukriti, where we had some serious outages in the banking sector, the regulator has taken a very proactive role to make sure that whenever there's any outage with the banking application and so on, these financial institutions have to report the outages. So what has happened is availability of these platforms has become one very, very important aspect for any financial institution today. So when they build a particular technology platform, one of the key requirements they talk about is, can I make sure that regardless of whether a server going down or a rack going down in my bare metal environment or otherwise, or even if a data center goes down, I should have availability and uptime all the time. And while I have that, the consistency of data should not be compromised. Meaning, if I were to transact something online to pay money to somebody else, the debit and credit that has to happen should be absolutely seamless, and it has to be reflected immediately. You can't have a case where inaccurate information is shown. So these are requirements which are continuing to grow. You're going to see more and more data centers, more and more cloud platforms launching regions here in India. So it's going to be more and more the requirement that people are going to look at optimizing the infrastructure. They're going to look at how do I, while I optimize the infrastructure, can I also make sure that while keeping my capex low, can I also make sure that it is easy and seamless for me to move from one platform to the other if I have to do so in the future. So this is where what I'm seeing. Obviously, on one hand, you have the requirements change from the consumers, but also from a these enterprise organizations perspective, they're looking at how do I evolve my architecture choices to be able to grow over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks for that, Avik. I'm sure the future that we are trying to decide upon today is a work in progress. Now, touch basing a very important element of cyber threat or data breach that we normally look at when it comes to FSIs, right? Does this real-time technology help prevent the cyber crimes and attacks?
Absolutely. In fact, we work with PayPal and a lot of other organizations in this space. And let me explain this in more detail, right? So as like I said, as more and more people get online, it is extremely pertinent that people identify fraud before it happens, or any kind of a digital fraud or a crime happening. You got to prevent it before it even happens. So that means that invariably, for you to be able to prevent it, you got to have some kind of a sense of what are the patterns that might exist, who might be the most if you can identify the kind of person who might commit a fraud or the kind of transaction that might lead to a fraud, that becomes very important. How do you do that? You can do that if you have technology platforms that can handle large volumes of data, and obviously in the downstream, you want to analyze patterns of data and say, hey, given this pattern, it looks like the probability of a crime is much higher. Now, this can only happen if you can handle massive volumes of data in real time. And while you do so, you got to make sure that you might have certain SLAs that you might have defined to be able to identify a fraud and so on. You got to be able to return the results in real time. So if you go back a few years, and in fact, if you don't have a real-time platform, let's say a database or a application that is real-time, then what's going to happen is you're going to take several seconds or minutes to be able to identify a particular transaction or properly characterize a particular transaction, which means that could lead to a false positive, which might mean that you might prevent a particular transaction happening and you might lose money on the table. Or on the other hand, you might allow a transaction to happen which is fraudulent. So having platforms that can handle massive amounts of data to be able to identify patterns, because these patterns are continuing to change. You got to be able to run these ML platforms to be able to continuously learn as more and more fraud types are happening. So it is very, very important that these real-time technologies are deployed to be able to, and in the front line, if you will, as a transaction happens, to be able to identify these frauds and prevent them. And we have been doing this for several organizations globally. I mentioned a few of them as well, where we've been helping these organizations handle massive amounts of data. You can look at it as an example where it is a payment application and so on, while also being able to, in a very quick, typically within a millisecond or few milliseconds round trip time, to be able to categorize and say, hey, these particular transactions look a bit iffy, and you've got to be careful about these transactions or whatever, right? That is something which you could do with super fast real-time platforms like Aerospike that can handle scale with low latency while keeping the lights on all the time. Now, one other key thing, and I want to talk about this aspect which we didn't highlight, but I think it's very important to the Indian segment, right? It's all great to identify fraud, to be able to prevent crimes, or identify risk as it happens. But you can't have a case where you're building these platforms and the cost of the solution is exorbitantly high, especially in these times where everybody's purse is a bit tight. You got to be able to make those choices where you optimize your infrastructure spend, optimize for your software spend. And what we are finding from an Aerospike perspective is working with these organizations, since we are a SSD optimized or flash optimized data platform, we're able to do so seamlessly for these customers. In fact, we bring down their hardware cost while they're able to introduce these solutions in the market and optimize for their environment, if you will.
Avik, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you, on staying relevant when it comes to the entire architecture of the FSI, I must say. And I'm sure our listeners today would have had a great time listening to what the future holds, and in terms of how the real-time technology and architecture is actually playing a crucial role in terms of changing the whole, landscape of the FSI sector. Avik, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Sukriti. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I think it was great exchanging some of these ideas and also talking with the larger audience. It was great. Thank you very much for having me on the show, Sukriti.
Thanks, Avik, once again. Audience, thank you so much for tuning in. And you have to stay tuned to TechGig for more such tech updates and podcast. I'll come back with another episode very soon. Till then, stay safe and take care. Thank you so much once again, everyone.